Who knows best about planning a city? Today on The Curious Task, I speak with Alain Bertaud. Welcome to The Curious Task from the Institute for Liberal Studies, where we explore economics, politics, philosophy, and other ideas from a classical liberal perspective. I'm Alex Aragona, your host, and today our guest is Alain Bertaud. Bertaud has worked as an urban planner in a number of cities such as Bangkok, New York, and Paris. He was a principal urban planner at the World Bank. After retiring from the World Bank in 1999, he worked as an independent consultant. He has been a senior research scholar at the NYU Marin Institute of Urban Management since 2012. Bertaud's research, conducted in collaboration with his wife Marie-Agnès, aims to bridge the gap between operational urban planning and urban economics. His book, Order Without Design: How Markets Shape Cities, was published in 2018 and will inform a lot of our discussion today. Alain, thank you so much for being on The Curious Task with us.
Thank you for receiving me and giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
So Alain, as we were discussing before, in each episode we start with a question and then go wherever the discussion leads us. So I'll toss it right over to you. Tell us, who knows best about planning a city?
A city is really created by spontaneous order. A city is created by the people who live there and work there. Now, those people create their own activities. They innovate. Usually, they buy houses, they build houses, they create business. However, when a city becomes very large, it is important to create an infrastructure which allow people to connect together. And this infrastructure is generally not produced by spontaneous order. Somebody needs to plan this infrastructure. My main disagreement with many of my colleagues is that many planners think that the most important thing in a city is to shape this city the way they think is more efficient. I think that the most efficient way of planning a city is not to invent a new shape, but to follow very, very closely what is happening, what the people are creating, and trying to connect, let's say, to support this spontaneous order rather than contradict it. So that's a bit the I would say, the misunderstanding about planning. Many planners think that they can shape a city the way a designer, for instance, would design a smartphone or something like that. And it's not at all the case. This is a complete misunderstanding of the city work. What is important in a city is to promote this creativity of the people who live in the city, and not to try to channel them in an area that the planner think is efficient. So the planner role is really a supporting role. It's not at all, they are not the Michelangelo of planning. They are not geniuses. They have to just follow. Sometimes I compare good mayors to janitors. That mayors don't like this definition, but basically, a janitor is a very honorable job. It's a very important job, by the way. A bad janitor can ruin a building in no time. So it's a very important job. But it's basically a janitor is supporting the people who are living in a building, but with infrastructure. And the janitor, for instance, monitor, for instance, the way the elevator works, and he knows the janitor will know when to repair the elevator or even change it. And that's his important job. It's a very important job. But the janitor is not here to say, I want Nobel Prizes on the top floor and then bakers in the ground floor, for instance. That's not his job. And that's planners are doing very often.
So it's fair to say that in your view, an urban planner's job is really to create a framework for a city to grow and progress in an efficient way, but not to actually specifically arrange things in the city.
Exactly. Yes. For instance, you had the example in many cities where I work, especially cities in Asia or Latin America, which are developing relatively fast. Practically every time, there are planners who say, well, in this part of the city, we will have all the health services. And here we will have Silicon Valley. And here, this is not the way things happen. So in a way, they are wasting resources doing that. And sometime even they could have had the Silicon Valley appear and they just kill it because they put it in the wrong place, or they restrict the use of it.
So something like zoning a certain area for, let's say, research and development, and zoning another area for health, and then zoning another area for education, and trying to keep other elements out of those zones. That would be sort of against the framework principle we just talked about then.
Absolutely. Yes. For instance, say, I remember in some years ago in Mumbai, they created in the right place, actually, a new CBD, the recentering, the center of gravity. That was a good idea because it was, but they decided that in this CBD, they should reserve it to exclusively financial services. Now, business is many other things than financial services. And the result was isolated building with indeed financial services. You could not find a restaurant in the whole place. You could not, you'll have to take a taxi to go to a restaurant or even get a sandwich. So that's a planning. I mean, this is a caricature, of course. Mm-hmm. Now, there is one aspect we didn't talk about, is that when you have a lot of people close together like that, there are indeed negative externalities. This became very apparent during the Industrial Revolution, where suddenly you had a lot of industries were extremely polluting, like lead smelter, for instance. And those were created usually close to railways, and the railways were usually in the center of the cities because that created really what economists call negative externality, the really bad effect. So here the planner has to intervene. But while these things were very clear during the Industrial Revolution, I think that now many planners consider that negative externality is just two buildings next to each other, one which is 2 floors higher than the other. This is not a negative externality. There is now. It is true that planning should regulate some use which are incompatible, but in a modern city there are very few use which are incompatible, compared to in the 19th century. And in a way, the market sort out these uses. For instance, say I live here in a suburb in New Jersey, a suburb of New York. The odds that somebody will want to create a steel industry in the middle of our neighborhood are zero, because the market will prevent it. The land is far too expensive to do things like that. The accessibility is not good for that. So I'm not saying that we should not have a law in Glen Rock which says no lead smelter should be built there, but it's completely irrelevant, in a way. On the contrary, to prevent, for instance, doctors or architects to open an office in a building, I think is a terrible mistake. It makes things much more expensive. There should be much more spontaneity in that. And we have example of this, let's say, more spontaneity in some cities of the world, like Tokyo, for instance, in Japan, where you have this you have a much more tolerance for different use of building and things like that. And I think it creates a very interesting compound. Yes.
I forget if this was in an interview you did or if it was in your book, but you told a story one time where you said that, and I forget which city this was, but you said you're in a city and the planners created a nice, beautiful government sector. But as you said, you couldn't find a restaurant or a tailor or anything you really needed in that area. So you actually had to go to the slums to get the services you needed. So that was a very interesting story.
That's right. Yeah, that was in Chandigarh, one of the first cities I worked in. Actually, I was still a student, and that was created by Corbusier in India as a new capital of the state of Punjab. And yes, the city was very ideally planned, with a separation of function, and it was planned like a smartphone in a way. And that's not the way city work, because the planner do not have the information which is required. No planners know how many coffee shops should be there and where. It has to be spontaneous. And so in this city, yes, you there was a shopping center which was planned, but it was mostly government-owned business, which it's not the type of thing where you will go every day. And so you will have the only spontaneous area where, in fact, the slum where the workers were building the city were living, and that's where you could find a good restaurant, coffee shop, or even tailors. Let's say at the time you in India you bought your clothes. Tailor-made, even if you were very poor, especially if you were very poor, it was cheaper.
So you mentioned it real quickly, but I'd like to go into it a little more. You said that basically the problem with trying to, as you termed it, be the Michelangelo of a city is that you don't have all the information you need to plan it in that way.
Absolutely. Yeah. And cities are also submitted to external shocks constantly. And a successful city is a city which adapt very quickly, in a Darwinian way to external shock. So the planners usually, when they see this external shock, they try to maintain the status quo by regulating it. For instance, say again, if we compare Mumbai to Hong Kong, both Mumbai and Hong Kong, their major industry in the 60s were textile. People have forgotten that Hong Kong was exporting textile. There was, if I remember well, it was about 40% of their GDP was manufacturing in Hong Kong. It was not services. And suddenly, those big cities, both Hong Kong and Mumbai, were not very well located for that. There were a lot of competition from, smaller cities. The industry also was old, the factories were old, the technology was old. Hong Kong immediately adapted. When they see that they were losing market share, they adapted the land use. They allowed the factory to rebuild, transform them into office building or housing or whatever, where Mumbai tried to freeze the cotton mills the way they were built in the 19th century because they thought they could preserve jobs like that. Indeed, they were good jobs, but when you see that there are those external shocks, which you have to adapt to it, and the people adapt. If you let them adapt, they will adapt. I mean, there will be a transition which will be painful probably, but they will adapt. Where in the case of Mumbai, they try to freeze this land use for practically 30 years, which resulted in enormous loss of welfare for the population, which were so again, this adaptation to external shock is what's important. And only the people who live in the city can do it. A planner cannot tell a factory, a cotton mill where to locate or how to change the technology or something like that. They can only say, well, if you want to leave, and let us see who is bidding for your land now.
In your book, and I think this ties nicely into exactly what you were talking about right there, you essentially say that cities are primarily labor markets. Do you feel that some of the problems with the way certain urban planners look at cities is that they actually don't have this fundamental view? They might think a city is for this, that, or the other thing, but they don't understand it as a primarily a labor market.
Absolutely, yes. That's very clear when the way they approach transport in particular. The planners have always a dream that they could match employment and housing close by. And that's, say, all the doctors will live there, and then you will have housing for doctors. I mean, I simplify a bit, but that's a bit the way to see it. There was this thing in the 19th century that you will have, you'll have factories, and then you will have the workers housing next to the factory. This is way, by the way, the Soviet and the Chinese plan also their cities. Because basically the workers belong to the factory. They were a factor of production. They were not individuals. They were the factor of production. So, but this, of course, you could have full employment that way, but it's not a labor market. People are allocated to a factory for their whole life, and you have there an enormous loss of productivity, although the people may be living very close to their employment thing, so that you save on transport, but you completely lose on productivity and personal initiative. So the labor market, the fact that you can change job, the labor market is not to get to your current job fast. It's to get to any job you may want fast, which is a different proposition.
Right. In your book, you say that one of the preconditions to increase productivity in a city is that firms and households have the freedom to stay put or migrate at will.
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And change up, to find the best. This is very, very true in particular for low-income people. I've seen that in developing country where low-income people are stuck because they are in very large cities. They have their only mean of transport is walking, and they are stuck in employment where in fact there would be better employment in other part of the city, but they cannot reach.
And that actually brings me to the second point I want to bring up. You also said another precondition to increasing the productivity of a city is that travel within the city remains fast and cheap. Urban planners should be focusing on this.
Right. Yes. Not reducing the lengths of transport, but increasing the speed. The lengths of transport is really defined by the size of the city. And again, this myth that you could match, housing and jobs is a myth, because if it worked, it would be wonderful. Everybody could, you could live in a city like Shanghai or New York, and all of us could walk to your work. I mean, that would be a lot of fun. But, again, some planners sometimes, instead of looking at a city as a labor market, I have the feeling they look at it like if it was some kind of Club Med or Disneyland,
Right.
We are all there to enjoy ourselves. Well, I hope we do. But, what is supporting our enjoyment is still the labor market. If the labor market collapses, there is no going to concert. There is no meeting your friend in a pub or anything like that. This is built on top of the labor market.
So you're saying basically that if my job is 10 kilometers away, but I can get there extremely fast, and on the other hand, another job I would have is 3 kilometers away, but I'm stuck in traffic for a long period of time. That's not helping anybody. So, but a lot of urban planners, you're saying, focus on the distance.
On the distance, yes, right, yeah, rather than the speed of transport, yes. Yes.
And you also say that, and I'm quoting here, real estate is sufficiently affordable that it does not distort the allocation of labor. That's another precondition to increase productivity in a city. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yes. You see, normally, if you look at any other area than housing, for instance, food or clothes, you will find that any city produce a range of clothes, which are very cheap and very expensive. In New York, you can find, I'm sure you can get a suit for $10,000 if you want, but at the same time, you can find a decent way of, clothing yourself for probably $50, and you can go to work with $50 of clothes. So you have this whole range available, and this adapts entirely to supply and demand. The same for food, in the center, in Midtown Manhattan, you find fantastically expensive restaurants, and then you have food carts too, which are there, and you can have a sandwich on the food cart, and it's a decent food. It will feed you. It's fine. In housing, you find that more and more, especially in the most successful city, again in the U.S., say San Francisco, New York, Boston, or Washington D.C. Practically, somebody who has a good job in the city, like for instance, a school teacher, or a fireman, cannot possibly find housing without commuting at least an hour and a half, or maybe 2 hours. And this to me is scandalous, because there is no reason for that. If you look in detail at the regulation which has been set up, very often, in order to improve housing, planners have a tendency to decide on the consumption of each of us, and they do not allow us to make trade-off between, say, distance and the amount of floor space that we want to consume. For instance, in New York, there is a minimum floor size for a new apartment, which, if I remember well now, is around 40 square meter, where, they were, say, old law tenement, which allow people to live in 27 square meter, where I live in one of them, by the way, when I arrive in New York. And that's a trade-off my family wanted to make. When we arrive in New York, living close to the center and sacrificing in a way area, but that was a straight up. The advantage of that is that we arrive in New York, we didn't know anybody, we were young migrants, but living in the center, we had very soon very close contact with people we work with, and we could maintain a social life where if we wanted to have say a 2-bedroom apartment, for instance, we had one child, we would have commuted to New Jersey or Long Island for 2 hours. It means that we completely sacrifice our social life. And so this trade-off has to be done by individuals. Planners can say, well, a school teacher, should have this area. The school teacher himself or herself should select what is the best trade-off for them. And this trade-off, by the way, may change with time. The first 5 years, they may decide that this is the best trade-off. After 5 years, they may decide to move to the suburb or whatever. But this should be left to the individual. All the regulation we are putting are preventing those trade-offs.
I think I'm very concerned myself when I hear, like, in municipal politics, when a certain community doesn't want a certain housing development maybe being built near them because the houses are, quote, too small for their taste. Nobody wants the smaller units near estate properties, and nobody wants townhouses near apartments. And as you're saying, this should be left up to the market and developers. Absolutely. And people choosing. It shouldn't be left up to groups of people to decide how other groups of people can and can't live.
Absolutely. You see, that's an extension of what I was talking before about externalities. Mm-hmm. To have a 3-story building, a townhouse next to a detached house is considered to be an externality in the same way as a lead smelter next to a primary school. It is not. It is it is not an externality at all. It is just an imposition. In a way, this thing. It's a dilution of property right in a certain way. Planning impose on you, you have a lot, you are the owner of this lot, but the planners say you cannot build more than 2 floors there, and you cannot have a business there. You cannot. So it's a decrease in your property rights. So sometimes those decreases are justified. For instance, if you want to have a nightclub which is very noisy in the middle, well, maybe there is a reason for that. But say in general, it's a decrease. On the other hand, your neighbors have an increase in their property right, not on their own lot, but on your own lot. For instance, if you want to create a bakery at the corner of a block, the neighbors will say, we don't want it. We are used to have a drugstore there, and we want the drugstore to remain there. We don't want a bakery. So this is an extension of their property right on your own property right, but at the same time, you have a dilution of their own property right. And I think this is very extremely detrimental to the growth of the city, and in particular to affordability of housing.
I think that takes us right to our break, Alain. That's been a great chat so far. So we're going to take a quick break, everyone. I'm talking with Alain Bertaud here on The Curious Task. The Curious Task is a podcast from the Institute for Liberal Studies. Feel free to send us questions and feedback to curioustask@liberalstudies.ca. A special thanks to our supporters on Patreon, including Randy T. Simmons, Rosa Pagliarello, and Sabine Elchediak. Remember to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter @CuriousTaskILS, and rate us on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you're listening to The Curious Task. Welcome back, everyone. You're here on The Curious Task, and I'm chatting with Alain Bertaud. Alain, before the break, we were talking about ultimately how decisions on development and real estate and where people live should ultimately be left up to the people involved in these transactions, not urban planners trying to arrange the way a city looks. And it actually reminded me of my neighborhood, because my neighborhood was very planned by an urban planner, but
Yes.
And I remember at some point I heard that there was a disagreement, something similar to that what you brought up, that there should be a little commercial park put in the middle of the neighborhood where there could be a bakery and things. And some people didn't want that. They wanted bigger houses there. And ultimately, somehow it ended up being that businesses could be put there, and now everyone loves it. Businesses can decide when to move in and out of there. There's like a seafood restaurant, there's a daycare, there actually is a bakery. So I think although some people were hesitant to have this idea that businesses can move in and out of this area as they please at the beginning, now people have grown to love it. So although this was still part of someone's plan, it still shows a little bit of the freedom of movement and businesses doing as they please, and people being able to to rent property the way they want is actually beneficial to a community rather than a scary thing.
Right. Yeah, I absolutely agree with you on that. And I'm glad that you have this positive experience that the change was possible. Because my experience, for instance, in my little city of Glen Rock here, and I've been participating in the planning board meeting several times, this would be absolutely impossible. Absolutely impossible. And basically, we have this strange conundrum in a city, is that a city thrives when things are changing, and to adapt to new income, new people, new technology. But most of the people who live in the city are extremely conservative in the sense that they don't want change. And they are very suspicious of any change. They feel that any change will bring things. So it is clear that the planner should do a little arbitrage here, in the sense that, for instance, in the case you were talking about, introducing some commercial area closed in a residential community, instead of saying even no bar or no nightclub, but saying, well, the level of noise after 10 o'clock should not be more than that many decibels. Something which is easy to measure and to reassure people that, they will not be kind of a 24-hour fiesta all the day or something like that. So you can do that also for traffic. For instance, if you want to have a supermarket, you could say, well, if there are that many car traffic, then it will have to be at the corner, and closer to where, you could have some restriction like that. But I think that it's up to the user to decide how they will adapt to it. For instance, if you want to have a nightclub in a certain, is noisy, and they feel that's the best location, they will have to comply to that by insulating and not allowing people to when they come out to make noise or something like that. You see that? So I'm not saying there should be no restriction at all, but I think that it's very often even the unknown which creates the most benefit. It's not even the known. So how can you plan the unknown, or regulate the unknown in advance? So you have to regulate it only by common sense. Again, the old externalities, if you look at the old Greek cities, for instance, of antiquity, and I found the same thing in Chinese city, actually, the old Chinese city, they all had regulation, some regulation about, for instance, you were not allowed to drop waters from one property to another. The water from the roof or whatever have to flow in the street and the gutter, not in the property of your neighbor. So these are good neighbors regulation, which should always be there. There's nothing wrong with that. But he didn't say the roof has to be this shape. It says no water from the roof should flow in your neighbor's lot, which is a very different proposition. And I think that planning has seen by extending design, the detailed design, into regulation, which in fact they were simple regulation at the beginning.
Yeah, I like how you touched on the idea of the unknown. Like you said, how can you regulate the unknown? I think a lot of people are scared of the unknown. Like if we put a commercial area in a neighborhood, what could possibly go there is what many people may think. But I think people tend to forget that people aren't going to put a business there just to bug you.
Right,
If it's a neighborhood full of children,
yes,
they're going to put a daycare.
Right,
if there's a neighborhood full of people that can spend money on a restaurant's going to go there.
Yes, right, exactly. A shopping center is not going to locate at the end of a cul-de-sac, a residential cul-de-sac. They will never survive there. So very often you have a sorting by the market by itself, and business are trying to cater to their client, which are basically the people who live there.
And in terms of the busyness of a city, you say that some urban planners are very scared of like growth or at least the rate of growth.
Right,
and I'm going to read a quote here from the book. You say, "To the chagrin of urban planners, a city's growth rate over the mid or long term is largely unpredictable, and it is futile to pretend it is the result of careful planning." So two-part question for you. Number one, why are some urban planners so worried about the rate of growth and how the growth occurs? And the second part of the question is, why shouldn't they be worried about that as much?
Well, they are worried because it's true that as a city expands, you have to develop the infrastructure which integrate this new part of the city. It is costly. although in the long run, it's an investment which is worthwhile, the city benefit, we have seen that. But so it's a little complicated, let's say, and people don't like to have their job becoming a little more complicated than what it was. There's also, of course, from the resident, sometimes the tax structure is such in the city that the people who live there have the feeling that they are going to pay all the extra cost of infrastructure for the newcomers, but the newcomer will not be charged with it. And that, I think, can be solved easily. There are many examples, like, for instance, in Texas, the municipal utility district, which has, I think, a very fair way of spreading the cost of new development on the new users, and making a very good portion, let's say, of the share infrastructure. So these are little mechanisms which has to be done. But in general, again, there's also a myth that smaller cities are more pleasant, or it is not quite true, that less crime or something like that. It's not quite true. Smaller cities are also much more vulnerable to economic shocks than a larger city. If you have only one employer, you have a city around a steel mill or a shoe factory, and suddenly the shoe factory move. Everybody there is, it's a terrible economic crisis, where in a larger city, even if the financial sector is not doing so well, then you will have something else doing well at the same time. On your question about planning the unknown, also, one of the success, if you look at Silicon Valley, which is still considered to be a success of creativity and creating new industries, they were the first people first it didn't occur in one city. It was over 50 municipalities.
Right.
So no municipality has the idea of we are going to create Silicon Valley. And the high tech was a mix of, in fact, small industrial thing and office building in a way. Programmers, you could say, it's like an office building, but somebody who is tinkering with a mouse is already semi-industrial. Apple and Hewlett-Packard were tinkering with hardware and software at the same time, were typically doing it in a garage in a residential area. And so the genius of the planners there was not to kill them.
Right.
Was not to say, hey, you are doing that in a garage, it's illegal, we are going to kick you out in an industrial area. And probably, Apple or Hewlett-Packard will not have survived in an industrial area.
Right. Yeah. I think that's very interesting you bring that up, because I think when we sit here in 2019 and look at what something like Silicon Valley is now, we forget about the origins of it.
Right,
I've read quite a lot about that, and it was interesting to me. I think I forget if it was in a book about Apple or if it was a book about Microsoft, but there was one of them that said that in the spare time of starting the business, some of the workers and some of the employees went to work in farmers' fields that were very close by as a part-time job.
Right. Yeah. Yes.
So
right, yeah.
they were in a diverse area. It wasn't that they were in a Silicon Valley designated area to start their businesses and grow.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And fortunately, I think the planners in there trying to put activities, each of them in the right box. They didn't know how to put a label on high tech, because again, this mix of tinkering with hardware and software at the same time. So they were not really blue collar worker in the traditional sense, but at the same time they were not office worker either. Because they were they are soldering irons and they're doing things like that.
And eventually, when companies like Apple got to a point where they could leave the garage, they needed office space, right? So one can only imagine if there was a restriction at the time that said only hardware companies can go in this office space, then we'd be in big trouble.
Exactly. Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
In terms of the infrastructure of a city, we were talking a little bit about this before, how people need to be, get around easy and things like that. There was an interesting part of the part of your book where you talked about cities being primarily labor markets. You said many people often forget about business to business movement in a city, like freight. When I read that, it was very Interesting. I had to stop reading for a second, and I sat there and thought that is true. When I hear about the municipal politicians talking about the city, or I even think of the city, sometimes I get very caught up in thinking of, person X going to Y job. I don't really sometimes stop to think about all the freight and all the business activity that's in a city too, that urban planners need to make sure can get through the city efficiently. So that was a very interesting point.
Yeah, this is a very important area, I think, that is neglected. Freight normally is between 10 and 20% of the traffic of a city, but it's absolutely vital. Imagine again a city like New York or San Francisco, and imagine the amount of food, for instance, which has to be brought in the city every day. The amount of skilled people just to maintain the air conditioning or the heating system. You have plumbers with their tools, which are constantly there fixing the city. You cannot ask those people to bicycle to work.
Right.
You imagine you have a sink which is overflowing, and you are in New York, and the plumbers say, "Well, I am in the L train and I'm stuck there," and you expect the plumbers to come here as fast as possible with his tools, and he cannot. So you have to admit that in a city you have a diversity of demand for transport, and you have to have, therefore, the response is a huge diversity of means of transport, which can be combined together to respond to this very different demand.
You talked about things being diverse in a city. Another aspect that of diversity you were talking about in your book is knowledge spillovers. If we segregate people and compartmentalize, we lose knowledge spillovers. Can you go into that a bit and explain why knowledge spillovers are so valuable?
Yes, this is really, I think, also the explanation that the economists give to the empirical data, showing that as a labor market get much larger, the productivity of each individual is higher, although it's a bit counterintuitive. When you go to Bangkok or Jakarta and you see the enormous traffic jam, the pollution, you say, well, how are those people more productive? You look at the data, you realize that still people working in Jakarta contribute to the wealth of the country much more than people living in a smaller city. And this is due to the spillover. The spillover is that you have people in the same office or next to each other who have very different skills, and they start learning from each other. I have seen that, during the computer revolution of the 80s, where computers start being introduced in offices. At the time, there was a real segregation between, say, what people call the support staff. Basically, secretaries were typing letters on typewriters, and then professionals were using computers and things like that. And little by little, the two fields start merging, and you could see secretaries who so far had only type letters. They were given draft and they were just typing. Suddenly they learn about computers, and they learn how to connect computers together to a network so that files will be sent directly rather than by mail. And this was a spillover. Suddenly you have people who had no technical knowledge before, but they learn on the job because it was absolutely necessary to do it. And rather than to say, well, we are going to continue to type letters, they decided to learn. And some, by the way, were unable to learn, but some did learn. And suddenly they were in a completely different field. And their productivity, if you imagine somebody was just typing letters, receive a draft, just type the letters. And suddenly this person, after 4 or 5 years, is able to run a network between computers and be sure that this network works well. Imagine the increase in productivity that this person has reached because of, again, this spillover. So there's a spillover within, of course, an office, but there's also a spillover, I think, by just maintaining social contact. Would certainly tell you, well, there's a job there, and then suddenly you don't feel completely, maybe comfortable with the job, but you take it and then you learn new things and things like that. I mean, for us, when we moved to New York, it was the 60s, yes, the late 60s, we found, that this social network that we established, was very important to get new jobs, new opportunity to work and learning new things. That's we always learn on the job. I mean, I hope most of us do, and we do that only again if we have a wide number of contacts that we establish either socially in bars and restaurants or clubs or churches or whatever, and we acquire that in city. In a small village, you know everybody. Everybody is very nice, but you do not have much possibility of learning things from others.
And even areas that we may consider now as blocks, like Silicon Valley, even in there's a lot of knowledge spillover. There's different levels of software being worked
Absolutely.
on. There's different types of computers and technology being worked on. So that's important for them as well.
Absolutely, yes, right, yeah.
There's a lot of people listening to this conversation that might think that we're spending so much time talking about sort of cities as they grow in large cities when these people might prefer a smaller city. When I've talked to people about this sort of thing, they think that, one day every city is just going to be a big city and there'll be no smaller nice cities to go to, if that's what they believe. And there was a part in your book where you did mention that it seems to be over time that the proportion of larger cities to smaller cities stays relatively consistent, because as you were mentioning before, smaller cities and larger cities actually play both very different roles, important roles, but different roles in an overall economy.
Right, yes, absolutely. And when people say I'd rather live in a small city, my answer is, well, why don't you do it? They, again, in a free society, this was not possible in the Soviet Union or in China. And even now in China, there are some restrictions. But in our society, this is part. There's nothing which prevents it. So we all made trade-off again. We make trade-off, and sometime at different time of your life, you will prefer to go to a smaller city, and this is fine. There are certain things which are better done in a smaller city. Things which are land intensive or sometimes labor intensive, but do not require extremely high skills. So you may have a very interesting, again, I don't want to give the impression that, there is no salvation outside a large city. That's not true. People make their own trade-off. This is true within a city, but it should be true at the national level, and I will expand it at the world level. Something about migration here. Imagine you are a young man in Bamako, Mali, and you have studied a bit. You are full of expectation, and you realize Bamako is so badly run. So many problems. There are power shortages. You don't see much of a future for yourself there. So you have a choice. Either you try to change Bamako to make it in a more efficient city. For instance, you have no power cut, the water is flowing in the tap, the garbage is removed, or you just move to Copenhagen or Brussels. And so you have this choice. Statistics shows that for the welfare of this person, moving to Brussels or Copenhagen will enhance the welfare of themselves and their family much certainly and surely than the opposite.
Right.
We have to consider this aspect. Now, I'm not saying that, necessarily every country can absorb as much immigration as. I'm not saying that really, but I think that we should look very carefully about these things, how much a city can absorb instead of outside migration, and that in the long run, it is, if they have established this threshold, how much time it takes for somebody from Bamako to adapt to the norms of Copenhagen. It's not so much the law of Copenhagen, it's the norms. There are certain norms in order to have a large city work that we all have to follow, and how long does it take to adapt to those norms? And then there is a case for much more open migration than we have, again on this thing, especially in cities like Europe, which are losing population in terms of demography, are losing population, or Japan or Korea, that, and very soon actually China is going to be faced with the same problem of demography. So the welfare of those cities is also based on absorbing migration and being able to integrate those migrants.
For sure, yeah.
Within a developing country, for instance, if I look at India, I'm not talking now about migration from outside India toward India, but within India, I think a big criteria for the success of a large city like Mumbai or Hyderabad or Delhi is you are absorbing people coming from the countryside who have skills which are real but useless in the city. They know how to grow mangoes, for instance, useless in the city. How fast are you able to integrate those people in the mainstream of the city? To have jobs which are city jobs, and I think that a large part of it is due to allow them to consume as little housing as they want, but have access to the infrastructure right away. Clean water supply, health, and education.
Right.
And do not fix yourself on, if they have just a shack with a corrugated roof on top of them. This is not important compared to access to clean water supply, garbage being removed from their neighborhood, and health and education. Unfortunately, planners concentrate on the opposite. They want everybody to have a 3-bedroom apartment, but because they can't, then they end up in a shack which has no water supply, the garbage is never removed, there's no sewer.
Right.
So it's a wrong trade-off.
Right. And if the planner sets a minimum size of house, let's say, like you were saying before, what they're effectively doing is saying anyone that can't match that minimum because of whatever their income situation or wealth situation, they're actually going to lose access to the city and the benefit that could come to them from just moving to the city.
And they also lose very often their property right, by the way.
Right.
They are there illegally, so if they are the victim of scams or something, they have no appeal.
And I think it's interesting that you touched on this, because I think when people think of immigration, whether it's from another country to another or even just within cities in a country, people tend to always think of what the effects of people moving to the city are, but they don't, so I should say costs, but they don't consider the benefits of that, right? Like, absolutely, as you said, yes. If cities are primarily labor markets, maybe an influx of people ready to work at a potentially, $2 less wage than the current worker somewhere else, that's a good thing for an employer. So there's a lot of costs and benefits, and on net, people moving to a city can be a net benefit just simply from being there and being new people to the city.
Absolutely, yes. And again, we should not neglect the spillover also of people coming with a different perspective.
Right.
Providing, again, that they adapt to the norms of the city, the behavioral norms of the city.
Right.
That's important, yeah.
And as you said, statistically, it's shown that sometimes moving for people is often just the best thing they can do for their own welfare and for their family.
And for their families, yes.
So preventing that with regulations of, like we were saying before, how big of a house they should live in and things like that, that's not helping anybody. It's not helping the city, and it's not helping the person in question either.
Absolutely.
Actually, that ties very nicely into another point I wanted to make sure I brought up here. I think we've discussed it a lot, but there might be more to as well, is that it often, unfortunately, is the case that the urban planners have good intentions for the poor or the lower income, but in reality, the results are not that at all. I think minimum housing sizes in certain areas is a good example of that. But I think there's many other examples of an urban planner's good intentions for a city or for those of lower income that just don't end up working very well.
Absolutely, yes. That's most of the regulation are well intentioned. I don't believe in conspiracy theory or something like that. Right. Keeping the poor out. I think that they are well intentioned. They just backfire. Something like rent control, for instance. There is a practically unanimity among economists that it's always backfire. So you give a small advantage for a few years to the people who are suddenly under rent control. They will be be able to spend more money on other things than rent for some time, but you practically freeze the supply of housing for everybody else.
Right.
So that means, again, I take this new school teacher, who is coming to New York. This new school teacher will never have an affordable house, because everybody is living in rent control. So rent control means also people are never going to move from where they are.
Right.
So that prevent also mobility within the city.
Right. Yeah.
Because the rent control, your subsidy is linked to the house. You are a bit like a serf. You are attached to the land. You are attached to your house. You lose. It's the same in a way with public housing. Your public housing, your subsidy is linked to. If you move out, you are losing it.
Right.
You have to stay where you are. So if you want to help people, it should be, if it's necessary, this help should be mobile. It should go with them. You should. You could help their income, with something like that if it's necessary, but certainly not link the subsidy to a specific location in the city, which is a case of rent control or public housing.
Right. So if urban planners want to help people out that have lower incomes, maybe they should consider, like you said, subsidizing an activity rather than subsidizing a piece of land.
That's right. Yes, right. Absolutely.
That is very interesting that you got into that, because if it's true, I find that a lot of at least public discussions, I'm not an urban planning expert, but the things you hear in the media and things you hear municipal councilors talking about, it's always to do with like solid things like the infrastructure, the bridge, the road, how people can move around the city, but they don't often concentrate on how regulations might cause friction for people to change a job or move into a different house. So that is a very interesting point.
Yes, right. And this is the essence of the city. Again, if you move to a very large city, it's precisely because there are a lot of jobs which are available there, and you may want to have the best for yourself, And again, we all have completely different skills. So sometimes we have a mismatch with our skill and our current job, and being in a large city allow you to match your skills with a new job.
Right.
If not, you are stuck in a job that you don't like, and you are probably not very good at it, and you are not very productive, and everybody suffers from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So this mobility is very important.
Do you feel that, because you touched on this earlier, do you feel that urban planners are also heavily influenced by the wants of communities? Because you said earlier that communities tend to be in a certain way very conservative, right? They don't like change around them.
Yeah, right.
They don't want a certain type of housing near them, that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah.
Do urban planners aren't necessarily people that are just like kind of isolated in their own bubble. I'm sure that they also feel sometimes unduly influenced by perhaps a community that doesn't want another housing area built around them or things like that as well, even if it's the wrong attitude to have.
Yes, I think that, by the way, we are always talking about urban planners here. It's a bit a proxy for the whole city administration.
Right.
There's city council, there's a mayor, there's also the political aspect of it. So we are, using the word city planner is a shortcut.
Right.
Many regulations are in fact imposed by the city planner are just implementing them. But yes, it's true. I can sympathize in a certain way for people who wanted, the status quo. However, they have to realize that themselves were able to move to the city because there were no status quo. When I see people in Chelsea, for instance, in New York, who live now in an 8-story building, and they argue against 12-story building, and they say we want to keep the neighborhood the way it is. Well, this neighborhood just 50 years ago were townhouses, and if they are able to live there in the 8-story building, it's because the townhouses has been demolished. And so in a way, they are closing the door after them. They were happy to move there, and they were not. Nobody in a city is an original city dweller. You're
right.
always there at a certain time. And so again, this change. What is interesting, again, we are getting back to property right extension. Very often those people, I'm talking about this Chelsea neighborhood, which is being discussed now in New York. One of their main argument against higher building on the avenues is because they have free parking along the street. And they say, well, there will be more demand for parking, so it will be more difficult to park free in the street. So you see, they have an apartment in Chelsea, but they consider that they have a property right on the street to park their car, where in fact that's not, this is a public space. The city should allocate it whatever is the best for the community.
That's a really good point. People, if they live in a city for a certain amount of time, they start to feel ownership of things beyond their own property, right?
Yes.
Even in Ottawa, Canada, where I'm recording this from, every now and then it'll come up every few months. If a certain street downtown should be shut down just for pedestrian traffic and bikes. Yeah. And in reality, if you go stand on that street in any given day, you see lots of things happening. People are dropping people off in cars. Freight is moving through. So for someone in a condo that says, I think this street should just be for me to walk around or bike around in, they're certainly only viewing it how they would like it, not how it benefits the whole city.
Right, yeah. You see, it's a bit, again, the city as a Club Med,
Right.
It's kind of fun if your street is a Club Med, but the rest of the city works well. But if all the streets are Club Med, then the city stops working.
If every area of a city was just a private neighborhood association, we'd have a lot of problems.
A lot of problems, yes, certainly.
Well, Alain, we've talked about a lot here, and at the end of every episode, I like to bring it full circle so you can have the last word and put a finer point on everything we've talked about, if it's possible. We did explore a lot. So I always ask, so if we can summarize it, what do you hope are the main takeaways for someone listening to you here on who knows best about planning a city?
Well, first, that the strengths of a city come from the spontaneous growth of the activity of the people who live in the city. And this growth and this individual initiative cannot be planned in advance. A city has to accept that there will be change all the time, and that those change are necessary to survival. On the other hand, you still have the need for a top-down planning when it comes to infrastructure, because trunk infrastructure, the primary infrastructure connecting different parts of the cities together, bringing water supply, removing garbage, this has to be done from the top down. It has to be designed. It's not spontaneous. You don't have spontaneous system to remove garbage from a very large city. You have to just study it, and from an engineering point of view. So, if you can conciliate those two aspects, the spontaneous aspect, which has to be respected, and the top-down design, which has to serve the spontaneous growth of the city, rather than to say, well, the city should be like that because it will be much more convenient for me to remove the garbage if the street were organized this way. I think this is the wrong approach. You have to say, this is the way people live at those densities in this type of activity. What is the best way to remove the garbage, rather than to say, I have to change land use in order to remove the garbage in a certain way. Now, I'm using garbage. Usually people use transport for that. But let's say they select a mean of transport, and they say, to make this mean of transport more efficient or financially viable, everybody has to live this way. I think this is a wrong approach. You have to find the mean of transport which serve the way the people are working right now, not to change the way the city is organized just because you want to optimize transport.
I think that's a great way to sum everything up. Alain, thank you so much for talking to us today on The Curious Task.
Thank you for inviting me. It was most enjoyable. Thank you so much.
This episode of The Curious Task was produced by Alex Aragona and Sabine L. Chidiak. Our executive producer is Matt Buffton. The music you heard on today's episode was created by Lindy Voppenfjord. You should check out his other stuff online. The Curious Task exists today because of donations of time and money from those creating it and listeners like yourself. Check us out on Patreon and find out how you can support us and get access to exclusive offers. I'm Alex Aragona. Thank you very much for joining us on The Curious Task.